Hi everyone, welcome to Itsy Bitsy's live read from Addie, To Wager on Her Future by Leenie Brown. Chapter 1. A sheep bleated as clouds floated overhead. The sun was warm and the smell of dew-dampened grass still clung to the edges of the breeze. However, all the perfectness of this spring morning was lost on Adele Atwood. Her focus was where it nearly always was, on a horse. This particular horse was a newcomer to the area, and even from a distance he was a beauty. Look, see how he rises from his seat just before his horse begins to fly down the course? Addie only spared a glance for her companion. She would not be distracted from watching such a fine beast and rider. How she wished she was still allowed to ride astride instead of constrained by society to ride aside. It was not that one could not cover a great deal of ground in a short amount of time while seated like a proper lady. It was just that one could not stand in her stirrups and urge her horse to thunder across the ground as the horse she was watching did. That, she spared her friend a second glance. That is what James needs to do. He rises but not so high, nor does he lean so far forward. Silverthorn's horses are fine animals, but they do not show as well as they could. If just one of our horses, could place near the front of the field, first or second, we could charge much more for the stallion's services. It was perhaps not the sort of thing with which her Aunt Edith would say a proper lady should concern herself, but her father would not reprimand her. Whenever her aunt visited, she was forever scolding Addie's father that Addie was given far too much freedom, and would never make a good match if she continued as she was. Her father would always give his sister a look which said she was speaking out of turn, and reply that he wagered she was wrong. "But your brother will not listen to you," Susan Price reminded her, "for to him you know nothing of horses." Addie groaned. "He has become such a ninny." James had not always been a ninny. At one point he had been a great friend and companion. It was his stupid friends who were the problem. They seemed to think it was a great sport to make fun of her and her friends, and her brother was too complacent not to follow their lead. Why must going away to school change a fellow so much? He never used to think of her as incapable of thinking as well as he did. "I likely know as much as he does," Addie grumbled. "It is not he who has been helping the grooms with the stables. That has been me. And do you know why? It is because he has been too busy doing whatever it is that his friends decide he should do." How she wished he would be his own man instead of following others. "He is only this term, and then he shall be done with school," Susan reminded her. "Surely, being away from his friends for long stretches of time will help, will it not?" Susan, who was as sweetened as a fresh-baked apple pie, was always tempting to find the good in a situation. Unfortunately, Addie was not certain there was a great deal of good left in her older brother. If there was, it was well hidden. The thought made her heart ache, for she missed the old James. "Do you think so? Do you not think so?" Susan repeated her question. Addie shrugged. She hoped it, but she was too uncertain to answer with a resounding yes. "Two of his friends are set to travel once they complete their schooling. That was a good thing. James was going to go with them until, and his not going with his friends would be an even better thing, except for the fact that it came at the expense of her father's condition." Susan reached across the gray mare on which she sat to grasp Addie's hand. "It is a terrible thing to have a father or an uncle fall ill." "And never recover," Addie added to herself. Susan still expected her uncle to regain his health and strength, but again, Addie was too uncertain to agree with her friend. Of course, a severe injury like Sir Thomas had sustained was not the same as a stroke, but the result was often the same, as the patient was either left in a weakened, nearly useless condition such as her father was, or more merciful, succumbed to death before he was confined to his chambers to waste away during his remaining months or years. It went without saying that she would never wish death upon her friend's uncle, but just as surely she also could not hope for him to survive in such a state as her father did. I almost wish James would be gone longer than his term. Mr. Shepherd heeds my advice because it is so similar to father's. I fear things will not go so well once James returns. They never used to argue as much as they do now. Again, she blamed his friends. Tom can help him, Susan offered, and if not, Tom then Edmund. Edmund is very good with numbers and exceptionally wise. Addie chuckled. It was just like Susan to offer help. She was excessively charitable, much like her sister Fanny. Providence had most certainly smiled upon Addie to give her friends such as Susan Price and Fanny Burnham, and for Addie was given to see dark clouds of trouble on the horizon rather than the sunshine Susan seemed to carry around with her. It had not always been so. Addie used to be nearly as cheerful as Susan, but then James had gone to school and become a ninny, and her father had had 2 strokes as in many years, and with the last apoplectic seizure 6 months ago, the running of the state had fallen largely on her, for her father could no longer write or do much for himself. She could have sent for James to come home, but her father would hear nothing of keeping James from completing his education. I am certain James would benefit greatly from their assistance, Addie said, but that is only if my brother will seek help from them. That was likely her greatest fear in the whole ordeal. Her brother might take advice from others to help settle into his new role as master of Silverstone Court. But would he accept it from a knowledgeable source, or would one of his friends move in and become co-master? She shuddered. If any of his friends were to do such a thing, it would likely be Mr. Willett. That gentleman was as slippery as a snake and likely just as dangerous, at least to a lady's virtue. For the gentleman was overly friendly sort of fellow, who said what he must do to charm whom he willed. She would likely find out in 2 weeks' time, when the term ended. Have you had a good ride? Edmund Burton's question interrupted Addie's contemplation of her brother. Indeed we have we not, Addie? Susan responded brightly. What brings you out on this fine morning? Is Fanny well? Edmund chuckled. Fanny was in perfect health when I left the parsonage. I was looking for Tom. He had wished to discuss some particulars about the work to be done on the damaged wing of the house, but he desired to ride out with Miss Eldridge first. Have you seen them? Both Addie and Susan assured him that they had not, and then agreed to join him on his ride, for neither of them had had their fill of riding. Was it even possible for Addie to have her fill of riding? Have you let your mare run? Edmund asked Susan. Not yet. We have been very sedatedly ladylike, she replied in a teasing tone. Indeed. I find that a trifle hard to believe since you are with Miss Atwood. Edmund's smile was warm and welcoming. I assure you that is true, Addie said with a laugh. Then, you would not be opposed to a race to that tree on the knoll? Edmund looked between Susan and Addie for the response. It was not the first time that Addie had raced with Susan and her cousin. Both Susan and Edmund knew how to be all that was proper when in company, but that was not always so. There was a small longing for adventure, safe, well-regulated adventure in both of them. I would find a good gallop to be most delightful, Addie assured him. Her longing for adventure was slightly greater and less well-regulated than that of her friends. She often dared to do things where they held back. As would I, Susan agreed. Of course, Susan's gallop would be less aggressive than Addie's. Susan was not so compelled to win races as Addie was. Then move ahead of me, Edmund instructed as he always did. Ever the gentleman, he always insisted on allowing the ladies to have a one-length advantage, and Addie seriously doubted if he ever truly gave his horse his head when racing with them. To Addie's way of thinking, the advantage was unnecessary. However, Mr. Edmund Burton was a sweet man, always looking to the needs of others whenever he saw them, or when his wife pointed them out. Therefore, she did not protest his directive if it did make the race somewhat unfair. Having taken her place in front of Edmund and across from Susan, Addie leaned forward and whispered a word of encouragement to her mount, a beautiful chestnut Arabian named Damien, and then, when Edmund shouted, She and her gilding were off. She continued to lean forward, urging Damon to fly. "You always win," Susan complained with a laugh, as she came to a stop a distance beyond the specified tree and next to Addie. "Silverthorn's horses are excellent," Edmund reminded Susan. "That they are," Addie agreed. "And Addie is the best rider I know, who is not male, that is," Susan added. "You know very few other female riders," Addie cautioned, although she knew herself to be a very apt horsewoman. She had not lost her seat since she was 12. Once had been enough. Thankfully, she had not suffered any serious injury. "I would have to agree with Miss Price." Addie turned to see the rider she had been watching earlier. When had he approached? She did not remember seeing him anywhere near where they were. "You ride very well," the stranger said. Then he leaned forward and added, "Likely better than my sister, but do not tell her I said so," he winked, causing Addie to smile. Whoever he was, he seemed a friendly sort of fellow. "Miss Atwood," Edmund said, "I do not believe you have had the opportunity to meet Mr. Eldridge." "No, indeed, I have not." She would have remembered meeting him. "Miss Atwood, this is Mr. Robert Eldridge. His sister, Miss Eldridge, is betrothed to Tom. Mr. Eldridge cleared his throat, and Edmund corrected himself. "My apologies, Robert. This is Miss Adele Atwood. Her father owns Silverthorn Court, which borders Mansfield to the south." The eyebrow over Mr. Eldridge's left eye arched. "Silverthorn Court?" That was a marked note of respect in the surprised question. "I thought you would know it," Edmund chuckled. "Mr. Eldridge is also in the business of producing fine horses." "How very interesting." A handsome gentleman who knew horses at least as well as she did. Was there anything better? "I was admiring his horse earlier. At least I assumed it was he who was riding here," Addie said to Edmund before turning to Mr. Eldridge. "Your horse runs very well." "Hugo is the best." Mr. Eldridge gave his horse's neck a pat. Addie's lip tipped into a smirk. "That has yet to be proven." Both Mr. Eldridge and Edmund laughed. "Addie is rather prejudiced," Edmund said. "As am I." Mr. Eldridge's head tipped as he studied Damon. There is one way we could determine the answer. We could have a short race." "An unfair one," Addie protested before she could think better of it. "What do you mean?" Susan asked. "Mr. Eldridge would not cheat, would you?" "No, I never do. I do not need to. As I said, Hugo is the best." "Oh, goodness!" A pretty blonde, whom Addie assumed was Miss Eldridge since she was accompanied by Tom, had approached and had heard the last comment. "Was my brother attempting to goad into racing?" She leveled a severe look at Mr. Eldridge. "I am gorging no one. Miss Atwood wishes for me to prove that Hugo is the best. Therefore, I suggest a short race as a way of determining the vicinity of my claim." "And I am happy to race," Addie said, "as long as the race is fair." Mr. Eldridge scowled. "Why would it not be fair?" "I cannot stand in my stirrups as you can," Addie answered. "Such a shift in position would give your horse an advantage that I am not afforded to give to my horse." Tom Vernon chuckled. "She has you there." Reluctantly, Mr. Eldridge conceded the point. "Then I will not rise from my saddle. I am certain Hugo can still outrun." He waved at her horse. "Damon," she supplied. "I am certain Hugo can still outrun Damon." He tipped his head and studied Addie's horse once more. "Or most certain," he added with a grin. He shook his head. "He is a fine-looking creature." "He thanks you for the compliment. Now where should I prove you wrong?" Miss Eldridge laughed. "I think I shall like you." "Oh, faith," Tom said, "I have been remiss in my duties. This is our neighbor, Miss Adele Atwood. Her father's estate, Silverthorn Court, borders Mansfield to the south." "Silverthorn?" She looked at her brother. "Is that the one you have mentioned several times as having excellent horse stock?" Her brother nodded. "The very one." Thank you for listening.